Welcome, dear listeners, to another tale from the Rainy Night Storyteller. Tonight, as the rain whispers against your windows and shadows dance in the dim light, we delve into a story of love, betrayal, and the chilling grip of vengeance from beyond the grave. In a quiet, fog-shrouded town in Sussex, England, a widower named Arthur Noakes thought he had left his past behind. But the vow of his late wife, Edith, echoes through the veil of death, haunting him in ways he never imagined. Prepare yourself for the Vengeful Ghost, a story that will chill you to the bone and leave you questioning the true weight of broken promises. Settle in. Let the rain guide your imagination and listen closely. This is a tale you won't soon forget. The town of Thornhill, nestled in the rolling hills of Sussex, lay swathed in a perpetual mist. Cobblestone streets twisted like veins through clusters of centuries-old cottages, their crooked chimneys belching faint wisps of smoke into the damp air. The town square, with its moss-covered fountain and sagging market stalls, seemed trapped in a bygone era. Thornhill's air was thick, not only with fog but also with the muted hum of whispers, a currency as valuable as the morning bread. Arthur Noakes was no stranger to these whispers. They followed him like the smoke from his ever-present pipe, curling around corners and slipping through closed doors. The townsfolk spoke of his charm, the glint in his eye, and the way he could disarm even the coldest of hearts with a lopsided grin. But they also spoke of his flaws. A widower with a wandering eye, a man unable or unwilling to keep his affections tethered to just one woman. He lived in a modest, ivy-clad house at the edge of the village, a place that once brimmed with life during his late wife Edith's reign. Edith had been a force of nature, a woman whose fierce love was matched only by her equally fierce jealousy. Neighbors recalled the way she clung to Arthur at gatherings, her nails digging into his arm if his gaze lingered too long on another woman. They spoke of her sharp tongue, her probing questions, and the way her laughter, once warm, had turned brittle in the final years of her life. Arthur had tried to move on after Edith's death, but Edith, even in death, refused to let him. It was no secret that her final days were marked by bitterness. Those who had visited during her illness recounted her chilling vow: "If you stray, Arthur, I will return, and I will make you pay." Such words might have been dismissed as the fevered ramblings of a dying woman, but in Thornhill, where stories of restless spirits and vengeful wraiths were told by firelight, they carried weight. The vow hung over Arthur like a storm cloud, a shadow he pretended not to notice as he courted his latest companion, Mabel, a lively widow who had recently moved to the village. But the townsfolk noticed. They always noticed. At the pub, they spoke in hushed tones over their Alash. "Mark my words," old Mr. Thistlewood muttered, his gnarled hand tapping the table for emphasis, "that Edith Noakes wasn't one to let go easily. If she said she'd come back, then she will." "And Arthur," a young barmaid whispered, her eyes wide. "Arthur's playing with fire," another replied grimly, "but he won't stop. He never does." Despite the growing unease around him, Arthur remained undeterred. He carried on as if the warnings were nothing more than superstition, as if the past were buried as deeply as Edith's coffin in the churchyard. He continued his evening walks with Mabel, tipping his hat to passing villagers and whistling an old tune. Yet, even he could not entirely ignore the chill that seemed to linger in the air, nor the faint scent of lilacs, Edith's favorite flower, that sometimes greeted him on those foggy nights. For Arthur Noakes, the line between memory and haunting was growing thinner by the day. But for the rest of Thornhill, the line was already clear. The dead don't forget, and neither, it seemed, did Edith. Arthur first noticed it on a quiet evening as he sat by the hearth, a book open in his lap and a tumbler of whiskey balanced on the arm of his favorite chair. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with a golden warmth that seemed to push back against the damp chill of the night. He was halfway through a chapter when he heard it, a faint whisper, like a breeze stirring through dry leaves. It came from behind him, just above his shoulder. Arthur. The sound was so soft that, at first, he thought he'd imagined it. He set the book down and glanced around the room. The house was still, the shadows cast by the firelight dancing harmlessly against the walls. Shaking his head, he muttered to himself, "Too much whiskey, old man," and turned back to his reading. But the whispers persisted. Over the next few days, they became harder to dismiss. They came at odd moments, when he was shaving, when he was locking up the house, even in the middle of a conversation with Mabel. Always the same, soft voice, "Arthur." Then there was the scent. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable. A whiff of lilacs as he passed the hallway where Edith's portrait still hung. He thought it was his mind playing tricks, dredging up memories of her perfume. But the scent grew stronger, lingering in unexpected places. His study, his bedroom, the kitchen where she used to cook. One morning, as he poured his tea, the smell was so overpowering he almost dropped the cup. "Damned flowers," he grumbled, though none were in the house. It wasn't long before the disturbances turned physical. One night, as he prepared for bed, the photograph of Edith that stood on his dresser toppled over with a sharp crack. Startled, he turned to see the frame lying face down. The glass splintered into a spiderweb of cracks. A chill ran through him, but he told himself it was nothing. The house was old. Things shifted. But then it happened again and again. Edith's favorite chair, a high-backed armchair she had refused to part with, began to move. At first, it was subtle, a slight tilt forward as if someone had just stood up from it. Then, one evening, as Arthur entered the parlor, he found it facing the fireplace, though he hadn't touched it in years. "You're imagining things," he told himself, but his voice lacked conviction. Mabel began to notice his unease. "You've been distant lately," she said one evening as they strolled along the riverbank. "Are you feeling all right?" Arthur forced a smile. "Just tired, my dear. Nothing to worry about." But as his relationship with Mabel deepened, so did Edith's haunting. Her presence grew undeniable. Shadows that should not have been there flickered at the edges of his vision. Reflections in mirrors caught her silhouette, a figure standing just behind him, gone the moment he turned. The cryptic messages began soon after. One chilly morning, Arthur awoke to find the words, "Remember my vow," scrawled in the frost on his bedroom window. His hands trembled as he wiped it away, hoping Mabel wouldn't see. Another time, after a hot shower, he found the same phrase etched in the steam on the bathroom mirror. "Who's playing tricks?" he growled, his voice echoing in the empty house. But deep down, he knew the answer. One evening, as he sat by the fire, Edith's ghost revealed herself more fully. The room grew icy, the flames in the hearth sputtering and dimming. A shadow stretched across the room, coalescing into a shape, a woman's shape. Her features were indistinct, blurred as though seen through rippling water, but her eyes glowed faintly, cold and accusing. "Arthur!" Her voice rasped, louder than before, filled with a bitter edge. He stumbled back, his heart racing. "Edith, you betrayed me," the apparition hissed. "You thought I'd forget, but I never will." As quickly as she appeared, she was gone, leaving only the scent of lilacs and a lingering cold that seeped into Arthur's bones. He stood frozen, staring at the empty space where she had been. For the first time, he could no longer deny the truth. Edith had returned, and she was not at peace. Edith's ghost seemed to burrow into Arthur's mind, dredging up memories he had buried deep. Late at night, as he lay in bed, the echoes of old arguments played in his ears. "You think I don't know?" Edith's voice would rasp, her tone dripping with venom. "You think I didn't see the way you looked at her?" Sleep offered no reprieve. Arthur's dreams were a patchwork of distorted memories. His wedding day, Edith's laughter turning to shrieks, the moment she clutched her chest, eyes wild with betrayal. He would wake in a cold sweat, her name on his lips, the shadows in the room seeming to shift and writhe. Even in his waking hours, the line between reality and hallucination blurred. He began to hear her voice in the ticking of the grandfather clock, in the rustle of the trees outside, and even in the faint hum of the kettle boiling on the stove. "Why, Arthur?" the whispers would say. "Why wasn't I enough?" Mabel was the first to notice the changes. Their once pleasant walks were now marred by Arthur's distracted air. He would stop mid-sentence, turning his head sharply as though someone had called his name. "Arthur, are you all right?" Mabel asked one afternoon as they sat by the village green. He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just tired, my dear. The house feels heavy these days." But Mabel wasn't convinced. She saw the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking. He began to cancel their outings, citing vague excuses about work or the weather. When they did meet, he was short-tempered, snapping at her over trivial matters. The breaking point came one evening when Mabel invited him to dinner at her cottage. Halfway through the meal, he froze, his eyes fixed on the empty chair beside her. "What's wrong?" Mabel asked, alarmed. "She's here," Arthur whispered, his face pale as chalk. "Can't you see her?" Mabel followed his gaze to the chair. "There's no one there, Arthur." But Arthur wasn't listening. He stood abruptly, knocking over his glass of wine, and backed away from the table. "I can't do this," he muttered. "I can't. She won't let me." Mabel reached for his arm, but he shook her off and fled into the night. After that evening, Mabel distanced herself. She sent polite but curt notes, declining his invitations and offering excuses of her own. The villagers noticed her absence and whispered among themselves. "Poor Mabel," they said, "caught up in Arthur's mess, just like Edith." With Mabel gone, Arthur was left alone in the echoing halls of his home. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker. He started avoiding mirrors, unable to face the spectral figure that often lingered just behind him. He found himself obsessively locking and relocking doors, as though a simple bolt could keep Edith out. He stopped sleeping in his bedroom, choosing instead to doze fitfully in the study, the firelight his only companion. The town began to notice his decline. He mumbled to himself as he walked the streets, his once pristine attire now wrinkled and stained. Children whispered that they had seen him arguing with no one in the cemetery, gesturing wildly at Edith's grave. Desperate to escape her torment, Arthur tried to rationalize the haunting. He told himself it was stress, guilt, or perhaps even the onset of madness. He consulted doctors, who prescribed him sleeping draughts and assured him that he needed rest. But the pills only plunged him deeper into nightmares where Edith's presence was stronger, her voice louder. "You'll never be free of me," she would say, her face inches from his. "You don't deserve to be." Arthur's paranoia reached its peak when he began to suspect that Edith wasn't just haunting him, but manipulating those around him. He believed the villagers were watching him, that Mabel had been frightened away by Edith's ghostly influence. One evening, he found himself pacing the study, a candle in hand, muttering to himself. "She's not real," he said, over and over. "She's gone. She has to be gone." But the candle flickered, the room growing unnaturally cold. A low, guttural laugh filled the air, and the scent of lilacs overwhelmed him. "Gone?" Edith's voice whispered, icy and mocking. "Arthur, my love, I'm right here." When he turned, she was there, her translucent form shimmering in the firelight. Her eyes, once soft and brown, were now black voids that seemed to pull him in. Arthur screamed, his sanity unraveling like frayed thread. From that night on, Thornhill would never see him the same. The man who once charmed the town was now a ghost of himself, haunted not only by his past, but by the inescapable presence of Edith's vengeful spirit. The haunting escalated with a ferocity that left Arthur teetering on the edge of madness. Edith's ghost no longer confined herself to whispers and shadows. She had grown bolder, more tangible, and her presence was now a constant, chilling force in Arthur's life. Arthur's nights became battlegrounds. He often woke with a start, his chest heaving, drenched in sweat. At first, he thought it was the nightmares, visions of Edith, her face twisted in rage, her voice a cruel hiss in his ear. But then the bruises appeared. One morning, as he washed his face at the basin, he noticed dark marks around his wrists as though someone had gripped him tightly. His first instinct was denial. Perhaps he had bruised himself tossing and turning in his sleep. But the marks were too deliberate, too precise. The next night, he awoke with a gasp, the sensation of cold, bony fingers wrapped around his neck. He clawed at the invisible force, choking out a cry for help, but the room was empty. The bruises on his throat the following morning were undeniable. "Leave me alone," he shouted into the empty house, his voice echoing off the walls. But Edith's presence remained, her phantom hands continuing to torment him in his most vulnerable moments. Edith's ghost began to manifest more visibly. It started with fleeting glimpses, a shadow flitting across the room, the outline of a woman standing at the foot of his bed. But as her power grew, so did the grotesqueness of her appearances. One stormy evening, as Arthur sat huddled by the fire, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The flames sputtered, dimming to embers, and the air filled with the cloying scent of lilacs. "Arthur!" Her voice came from the corner of the room. He turned slowly, dread clawing at his stomach. There she stood, fully formed yet horrifyingly distorted. Her once lovely face was a ruin, her skin gray and mottled, her lips blue as though frozen. Her eyes, now hollow sockets, burned with an unnatural light. Her dress, the one she had been buried in, was tattered and caked with dirt, the hem soaked in what looked like blood. "Do you remember me?" she rasped, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Do you remember your promise?" Arthur stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the rug. "Stay away from me," he screamed, his voice cracking. But Edith advanced, her movements jerky and inhuman, her skeletal hands outstretched. "You betrayed me," she hissed. "Now you'll feel what I felt." Arthur scrambled to his feet and fled the room, slamming the door behind him. But the laughter that followed him, low and guttural, told him there was no escape. Edith's rage soon turned outward, and Mabel became her next victim. It started subtly, just as it had with Arthur. Mabel began noticing odd occurrences in her home. The scent of lilacs lingering in her kitchen, her belongings moved to places she hadn't left them, the faint sound of footsteps pacing outside her bedroom at night. One evening, as Mabel prepared for bed, her reflection in the mirror shifted. For a brief moment, it wasn't her face staring back, but Edith's, decayed, glaring, and full of hate. Mabel screamed, stumbling back, the mirror shattering as if struck by an invisible force. She ran to Arthur the next day, pale and trembling. "There's something in my house," she whispered. "Something unnatural." Arthur's heart sank. He knew what it was. "She's targeting you now," he admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "She knows I care for you. She's trying to hurt me through you." Desperate to protect Mabel, Arthur insisted she stay at his house, believing he could shield her from Edith's wrath. But this only seemed to enrage the ghost further. One night, as they sat together in the parlor, the lights flickered and died. The room plunged into darkness, and the air grew thick with cold. "Arthur," Mabel whispered, her voice trembling, "she's here." Before Arthur could respond, Edith appeared, her grotesque form materializing in the center of the room. She let out a piercing scream, the sound so intense it rattled the windows. "Arthur, you think you can save her?" Edith sneered, her voice a venomous hiss. "You couldn't save me, and you won't save her." As Edith advanced on Mabel, Arthur threw himself between them. "Leave her alone," he shouted. The ghost paused, her hollow gaze fixed on him. "You think you can bargain with me, Arthur? You owe me." In that moment, Arthur realized the truth. There was no reasoning with Edith. Her jealousy and anger had consumed her, turning her into something monstrous. If he didn't act soon, Mabel would suffer the same fate as Edith, a life destroyed by his selfishness. As Edith's ghost lunged, Arthur grabbed a heavy candlestick and swung it through her form. She vanished in an explosion of cold air, her laughter lingering long after she was gone. But Arthur knew this was only the beginning. Edith's power was growing, and the ghost wasn't done with them yet. The haunting had become unbearable, a torment that left Arthur a shell of the man he once was. Edith's ghost was no longer content with subtle reminders or eerie manifestations. Her wrath was now relentless and consuming. Arthur knew he couldn't endure much longer. If he wanted any hope of saving himself and Mabel, he would have to fight back. Arthur's first stop was the village church, a modest stone building that had stood for centuries. He approached Father Merrick, a man known for his measured demeanor and logical mind. "You've been through a great deal," the priest said after hearing Arthur's story, his expression sympathetic but cautious. Grief and guilt can play tricks on the mind. Arthur leaned forward, desperation etched into every line of his face. "This isn't in my mind, Father. She's real. She's here. I've seen her. Mabel has seen her." Father Merrick hesitated before nodding. "Very well. I will come to your home and perform a blessing. Perhaps it will bring you peace." That evening, Father Merrick arrived at Thornhill with a Bible and a vial of holy water. He moved room to room, murmuring prayers and sprinkling the water across thresholds and windowsills. Arthur followed close behind, clutching a crucifix as though it were a lifeline. At first, the house was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. But as the priest began blessing the parlor, the temperature plummeted. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the room. "Arthur," Edith's voice rasped, "did you really think this would work?" The lights flickered violently, and the priest staggered back as a shadowy figure coalesced in the corner. This is unholy," Father Merrick stammered, his voice shaking. "Leave," Edith screamed, her voice a deafening roar. The priest fled, leaving Arthur alone to face her wrath. The failure of the blessing led Arthur to Mrs. Pritchard, a local medium known for her eccentricities and whispered about talents. Her small cottage was crammed with strange artifacts, jars of herbs, talismans, and faded photographs of her clients. "You've brought something powerful into your life," Mrs. Pritchard said as she examined Arthur with sharp, knowing eyes. "Something angry." "She's my wife," Arthur admitted. "Or she was. She's dead now, but she won't leave me." Mrs. Pritchard nodded solemnly. "Spirits like hers don't linger without a reason. They're tethered by anger, by love, or by an object. If we can find what ties her here, we may be able to sever the connection." Arthur allowed Mrs. Pritchard into his home, where she conducted a séance. Sitting at a table in the dimly lit dining room, she called out to Edith, her hands resting on a crystal orb. "Edith Noakes," she intoned, her voice firm, "show yourself." The room grew cold, and the air thickened with the scent of lilacs. Edith's ghost appeared, her hollow eyes fixed on Arthur. "What do you want?" the medium demanded. "I want what's mine," Edith snarled, her voice a bitter hiss. "Arthur betrayed me, and I'll never forgive him." Through the séance, Mrs. Pritchard discerned that Edith's spirit was tethered to an object she had cherished in life. Her wedding ring, which Arthur had kept in a small wooden box in his desk. "You must destroy it," the medium said after Edith vanished. "Only then will she be freed from this plane." Despite Mrs. Pritchard's warning, Arthur hesitated to destroy the ring. It felt like a betrayal of Edith, a final act of severing the bond they once shared. Instead, he began researching on his own, combing through old tomes and journals he found in the dusty archives of the local library. He discovered references to rituals that could banish spirits, though many were incomplete or cryptic. Late into the night, he pored over the texts, piecing together instructions. A protective circle of salt, the burning of sage, and an incantation spoken under the light of the full moon. When the night arrived, Arthur prepared the ritual in the garden behind Thornhill. He placed Edith's wedding ring in the center of the circle, surrounded by candles. The air was still, heavy with anticipation, as he began to chant the words he had memorized. At first, nothing happened, but then the wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the candles flickered wildly. Edith's ghost materialized, her decayed form more grotesque than ever. "You dare try to banish me?" she shrieked, her voice filled with fury. The circle of salt glowed faintly, holding her at bay, but Arthur could feel her power pressing against it. "You don't belong here, Edith," he shouted, his voice breaking. "Let go." "You were mine, Arthur," she hissed, stepping closer to the edge of the circle. "And if I can't have you, no one will." The ground beneath him trembled as the ritual reached its climax. The wedding ring began to glow red-hot, and Edith let out an ear-splitting scream. With one final incantation, Arthur threw a vial of holy water onto the ring. Edith's ghost dissolved into a burst of cold air, her scream fading into silence. The candles went out, leaving Arthur alone in the darkness, trembling and gasping for breath. Though the haunting was over, Arthur felt no relief. The house was quiet now, but it was a hollow, suffocating silence. He had destroyed the ring and banished Edith, but the guilt of her death and the betrayal that followed would haunt him forever. Mabel returned, but their relationship was strained. Though she tried to comfort him, Arthur could never fully escape the shadow of what he had done, or what Edith had become. Thornhill was no longer a home. It was a tomb, filled with memories he could neither escape nor forget. The final confrontation between Arthur and Edith's ghost was inevitable. Her hauntings had reached a fever pitch, and Arthur could no longer deny the truth. To end this torment, he would have to face her directly and destroy the wedding ring that bound her to this world. Arthur spent hours fortifying himself, both physically and mentally. The tools for his plan, a hammer, a vial of holy water, and a prayer he'd memorized from an old tome, were laid out on the dining table. The wedding ring, a small but weighty piece of gold, rested in the center, its once innocuous shine now an ominous glint in the flickering candlelight. He knew Edith would not let this happen without a fight. She had grown stronger, more vindictive, and her power over him was no longer just psychological. It was physical, visceral, and deadly. As midnight approached, Arthur positioned himself in the parlor, where her hauntings had always been the strongest. He placed the ring on the hearth, its golden surface catching the faint glow of the dying fire. "Come on, Edith," he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. "Let's finish this." The air in the room grew cold, and the faint scent of lilacs wafted through the air. The candles flickered violently before extinguishing altogether, leaving Arthur in near total darkness. "Arthur!" Her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a haunting whisper that curled around his ears like smoke. Then she appeared, fully manifested, her grotesque form more terrifying than ever. Her decayed skin clung to her bones, her hollow eyes burned with malevolence, and her tattered burial dress billowed as though caught in an invisible wind. "You think you can destroy me?" she snarled, her voice a mixture of rage and pain. "You think breaking a ring can erase what you did?" Arthur gripped the hammer tightly, his knuckles white. "You don't belong here, Edith. This has to end." She laughed, a chilling, echoing sound. "End? Oh no, Arthur. It's only just beginning." As she spoke, the room transformed around him. Shadows shifted and stretched, forming vignettes of their past life together. Arthur saw Edith in the early days of their marriage, radiant, loving, and full of hope. Then the scenes darkened. Arguments over his infidelity, her desperate pleas for his attention, the bitterness that consumed their final years together. "You betrayed me," Edith hissed, stepping closer. "You made me feel worthless, invisible, and then you laughed behind my back, as if my pain was a joke." Arthur fell to his knees, clutching his head as the memories overwhelmed him. He saw himself with other women, heard Edith's anguished cries when she discovered his betrayals, felt the crushing guilt he had buried deep for so long. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, Edith." But Edith was relentless. "Sorry won't bring me peace. Sorry won't undo what you did." Arthur forced himself to his feet, his resolve hardening. "You're right," he said, his voice steadier now. "But staying here won't bring you peace either. It's time to let go, Edith." With a roar of fury, Edith lunged at him, her skeletal hands wrapping around his throat. The air around them crackled with her energy, and Arthur felt the life being drained from his body. Summoning all his strength, he reached for the hammer and swung it down onto the ring. The impact sent a shockwave through the room, and Edith let out an unearthly scream, her form flickering like a dying flame. "You'll never escape me," she shrieked, her voice splintering into echoes. Arthur raised the hammer again, this time bringing it down with all his might. The ring shattered, fragments scattering across the hearth. The moment the ring broke, Edith's ghost let out a final, piercing scream before disintegrating into a cloud of ash. The room fell silent, the oppressive cold lifting as warmth returned to the air. Arthur collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The battle was over, but it had come at a cost. As the dust settled and the final echoes of Edith's wrath faded, Arthur sat in the silence of Thornhill's parlor. The shattered remains of the wedding ring lay scattered across the hearth, glittering like shards of glass in the dim firelight. The air, once suffocatingly cold, was warm again, but it carried an unsettling stillness, a quiet too profound to be comforting. Arthur wanted to believe it was over, that Edith had finally departed and found whatever peace had eluded her in life. Yet, as the clock struck midnight, a subtle unease lingered, leaving the question of her true departure shrouded in ambiguity. Arthur sat in his armchair, staring into the dying embers of the fireplace. His body was exhausted, but his mind churned with questions and doubts. Was it truly over? Had he succeeded in severing Edith's hold on this world? As he reached for the glass of brandy on the side table, the flames in the fireplace flickered unnaturally, leaping high before dimming to almost nothing. Arthur froze, his hand hovering over the glass. Then, faint and fleeting, came the sound. A soft, familiar laugh, delicate as a breeze yet unmistakable. "Edith." Arthur's heart raced, and he whipped his head around the room, scanning the shadows for any sign of her. But there was nothing. No ghostly figure, no cold presence. Just the faint scent of lilacs, hanging in the air like a question unanswered. The candle on the mantel guttered suddenly, its flame wavering as though caught in an invisible breath, before steadying once more. Arthur stared at it, his pulse pounding in his ears. Was it just his imagination? Or had Edith left behind a piece of herself, an eternal reminder of her vow? Days turned into weeks, and Arthur tried to rebuild his life. Mabel, ever kind and patient, returned to his side, though their relationship was now marked by an unspoken tension. Arthur had told her little of what had transpired that night, brushing it off as a bad dream. But the shadows in Thornhill seemed deeper now, the air heavier. Strange things began to happen, not with the ferocity of Edith's earlier hauntings, but with a sinister subtlety. One evening, as Arthur and Mabel sat together in the drawing room, the lights dimmed inexplicably. A framed photograph of the couple toppled over, landing face down on the table. "Must be a draft," Arthur said quickly, his voice too loud, too forced. Mabel nodded, but her expression betrayed her unease. She had begun to hear whispers when alone in the house, faint and indistinct, but always carrying a tone of disapproval. One night, as she brushed her hair in the bedroom mirror, she froze. In the corner of the glass, just over her shoulder, she saw a fleeting image, a woman with hollow eyes and a bitter smile. Mabel spun around, but the room was empty. When she told Arthur, he paled but said nothing. Deep down, He feared the truth he couldn't admit. Edith's curse had not ended. It had merely shifted its focus. Arthur sitting alone in the darkened parlor, staring at the flickering fire. The house is quiet, but the silence is heavy with an unseen presence. A shadow moves across the wall, though nothing in the room has shifted. Arthur whispers to himself, his voice trembling, "You're gone. I destroyed the ring. You're gone." But as he speaks, the faint scent of lilacs returns, and the candle on the mantel flares brightly before extinguishing altogether. Somewhere in the distance, barely audible, comes the soft sound of Edith's voice, carrying a chilling promise. "I told you, Arthur, you'll never be free." Thank you for joining me for tonight's tale, The Vengeful Ghost. I hope it left you with a sense of wonder and unease, a perfect match for a rainy night like this. But don't go just yet. The evening isn't over, and I have another gripping story for you. Next, we'll explore a hauntingly suspenseful narrative by Ambrose Bierce, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. This tale takes us to the heart of the American Civil War, where a condemned man stands at the edge of fate, grappling with the boundaries of time, reality, and the human mind. Settle in, let the rain guide your thoughts, and allow yourself to be transported into another world. Let's begin. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Part 1. A man stood upon a railroad bridge in northern Alabama, looking down into the swift water 20 feet below. The man's hands were behind his back, the wrists bound with a cord. A rope closely encircled his neck. It was attached to a stout cross timber above his head, and the slack fell to the level of his knees. Some loose boards laid upon the sleepers supporting the metals of the railway supplied a footing for him and his executioners, 2 private soldiers of the Federal Army, directed by a sergeant who in civil life may have been a deputy sheriff. At a short remove upon the same temporary platform was an officer in the uniform of his rank, armed. He was a captain. A sentinel at each end of the bridge stood with his rifle in the position known as support, that is to say, vertical in front of the left shoulder, the hammer resting on the forearm thrown straight across the chest, a formal and unnatural position, enforcing an erect carriage of the body. It did not appear to be the duty of these 2 men to know what was occurring at the center of the bridge. They merely blockaded the 2 ends of the foot planking that traversed it. Beyond one of the sentinels, nobody was in sight. The railroad ran straight away into a forest for 100 yards, then, curving, was lost to view. Doubtless there was an outpost farther along. The other bank of the stream was open ground, a gentle acclivity topped with a stockade of vertical tree trunks, loopholed for rifles, with a single embrasure through which protruded the muzzle of a brass cannon commanding the bridge. Midway of the slope between bridge and fort were the spectators, a single company of infantry in line, at parade rest, the butts of the rifles on the ground, the barrels inclining slightly backward against the right shoulder, the hands crossed upon the stock. A lieutenant stood at the right of the line, the point of his sword upon the ground, his left hand resting upon his right. Excepting the group of 4 at the center of the bridge, not a man moved. The company faced the bridge, staring stonily, motionless. The sentinels, facing the banks of the stream, might have been statues to adorn the bridge. The captain stood with folded arms, silent, observing the work of his subordinates, but making no sign. Death is a dignitary who, when he comes announced, is to be received with formal manifestations of respect, even by those most familiar with him. In the code of military etiquette, silence and fixity are forms of deference. The man who was engaged in being hanged was apparently about 35 years of age. He was a civilian, if one might judge from his habit, which was that of a planter. His features were good, a straight nose, firm mouth, broad forehead, from which his long, dark hair was combed straight back, falling behind his ears to the collar of his well-fitting frock coat. He wore a mustache and pointed beard, but no whiskers. His eyes were large and dark gray, and had a kindly expression which one would hardly have expected in one whose neck was in the hemp. Evidently this was no vulgar assassin. The liberal military code makes provision for hanging many kinds of persons, and gentlemen are not excluded. The preparations being complete, the two private soldiers stepped aside and each drew away the plank upon which he had been standing. The sergeant turned to the captain, saluted, and placed himself immediately behind that officer, who in turn moved apart one pace. These movements left the condemned man and the sergeant standing on the two ends of the same plank, which spanned three of the crossed eyes of the bridge. The end upon which the civilian stood almost, but not quite, reached a fourth. This plank had been held in place by the weight of the captain. It was now held by that of the sergeant. At a signal from the former, the latter would step aside. The plank would tilt, and the condemned man go down between two ties. The arrangement commended itself to his judgment as simple and effective. His face had not been covered, nor his eyes bandaged. He looked a moment at his unsteadfast footing, then let his gaze wander to the swirling water of the stream racing madly beneath his feet. A piece of dancing driftwood caught his attention, and his eyes followed it down the current. How slowly it appeared to move! What a sluggish stream! He closed his eyes in order to fix his last thoughts upon his wife and children. The water, touched to gold by the early sun, the brooding mists under the banks at some distance down the stream, the fort, the soldiers, the piece of drift, all had distracted him. And now he became conscious of a new disturbance. Striking through the thought of his dear ones was a sound which he could neither ignore nor understand. A sharp, distinct, metallic percussion like the stroke of a blacksmith's hammer upon the anvil. It had the same ringing quality. He wondered what it was, and whether immeasurably distant or nearby. It seemed both. Its recurrence was regular, but as slow as the tolling of a death knell. He awaited each stroke with impatience and, he knew not why, apprehension. The intervals of silence grew progressively longer. The delays became maddening. With their greater infrequency, the sounds increased in strength and sharpness. They hurt his ear like the thrust of a knife. He feared he would shriek. What he heard was the ticking of his watch. He unclosed his eyes and saw again the water below him. If I could free my hands, he thought, I might throw off the noose and spring into the stream. By diving I could evade the bullets and, swimming vigorously, reach the bank, take to the woods and get away home. My home, thank God, is as yet outside their lines. My wife and little ones are still beyond the invaders' farthest advance. As these thoughts, which have here to be set down in words, were flashed into the doomed man's brain rather than evolved from it, the captain nodded to the sergeant. The sergeant stepped aside. Part 2. Peyton Farquhar was a well-to-do planter of an old and highly respected Alabama family. Being a slave owner and like other slave owners a politician, he was naturally an original secessionist and ardently devoted to the Southern cause. Circumstances of an imperious nature, which it is unnecessary to relate here, had prevented him from taking service with the gallant army that had fought the disastrous campaigns ending with the fall of Corinth, and he chafed under the inglorious restraint, longing for the release of his energies, the larger life of the soldier, the opportunity for distinction. That opportunity, he felt, would come, as it comes to all in wartime. Meanwhile, he did what he could. No service was too humble for him to perform in aid of the South, no adventure too perilous for him to undertake if consistent with the character of a civilian who was at heart a soldier, and who in good faith, and without too much qualification, assented to at least a part of the frankly villainous dictum that all is fair in love and war. One evening, while Farquhar and his wife were sitting on a rustic bench near the entrance to his grounds, a gray-clad soldier rode up to the gate and asked for a drink of water. Mrs. Farquhar was only too happy to serve him with her own white hands. While she was fetching the water, her husband approached the dusty horseman and inquired eagerly for news from the front. "The Yanks are repairing the railroads," said the man, "and are getting ready for another advance. They have reached the Owl Creek Bridge, put it in order, and built a stockade on the north bank. The commandant has issued an order, which is posted everywhere, declaring that any civilian caught interfering with the railroad, its bridges, tunnels, or trains will be summarily hanged. I saw the order. How far is it to the Owl Creek Bridge? Farquhar asked. About 30 miles. Is there no force on this side the creek? Only a picket post half a mile out, on the railroad, and a single sentinel at this end of the bridge. Suppose a man, a civilian and student of hanging, should elude the picket post and perhaps get the better of the sentinel, said Farquhar, smiling. What could he accomplish? The soldier reflected. I was there a month ago, he replied. I observed that the flood of last winter had lodged a great quantity of driftwood against the wooden pier at this end of the bridge. It is now dry and would burn like tow. The lady had now brought the water, which the soldier drank. He thanked her ceremoniously, bowed to her husband, and rode away. An hour later, after nightfall, he repassed the plantation, going northward in the direction from which he had come. He was a Federal scout. Part 3. As Peyton Farquhar fell straight downward through the bridge, he lost consciousness and was as one already dead. From this state he was awakened, ages later, it seemed to him, by the pain of a sharp pressure upon his throat, followed by a sense of suffocation. Keen, poignant agonies seemed to shoot from his neck downward through every fiber of his body and limbs. These pains appeared to flash along well-defined lines of ramification and to beat with an inconceivably rapid periodicity. They seemed like streams of pulsating fire heating him to an intolerable temperature. As to his head, he was conscious of nothing but a feeling of fullness, of congestion. These sensations were unaccompanied by thought. The intellectual part of his nature was already effaced. He had power only to feel, and feeling was torment. He was conscious of motion, encompassed in a luminous cloud, of which he was now merely the fiery heart, without material substance. He swung through unthinkable arcs of oscillation, like a vast pendulum. Then all at once, with terrible suddenness, the light about him shot upward with the noise of a loud plash. A frightful roaring was in his ears, and all was cold and dark. The power of thought was restored. He knew that the rope had broken and he had fallen into the stream. There was no additional strangulation. The noose about his neck was already suffocating him and kept the water from his lungs. To die of hanging at the bottom of a river. The idea seemed to him ludicrous. He opened his eyes in the darkness and saw above him a gleam of light. But how distant, how inaccessible. He was still sinking, for the light became fainter and fainter until it was a mere glimmer. Then it began to grow and brighten, and he knew that he was rising toward the surface, knew it with reluctance, for he was now very comfortable. To be hanged and drowned, he thought, that is not so bad, but I do not wish to be shot. No, I will not be shot, that is not fair. He was not conscious of an effort, but a sharp pain in his wrist apprised him that he was trying to free his hands. He gave the struggle his attention, as an idler might observe the feat of a juggler, without interest in the outcome. What splendid effort! What magnificent, what superhuman strength! Ah, that was a fine endeavor. Bravo! The cord fell away. His arms parted and floated upward, the hands dimly seen on each side in the growing light. He watched them with a new interest as first one and then the other pounced upon the noose at his neck. They tore it away and thrust it fiercely aside, its undulations resembling those of a water snake. Put it back, put it back. He thought he shouted these words to his hands, for the undoing of the noose had been succeeded by the direst pang that he had yet experienced. His neck ached horribly. His brain was on fire. His heart, which had been fluttering faintly, gave a great leap, trying to force itself out at his mouth. His whole body was racked and wrenched with an insupportable anguish, but his disobedient hands gave no heed to the command. They beat the water vigorously with quick, downward strokes, forcing him to the surface. He felt his head emerge. His eyes were blinded by the sunlight. His chest expanded convulsively, and with a supreme and crowning agony his lungs engulfed a great draught of air, which instantly he expelled in a shriek. He was now in full possession of his physical senses. They were Indeed, preternaturally keen and alert. Something in the awful disturbance of his organic system had so exalted and refined them that they made record of things never before perceived. He felt the ripples upon his face and heard their separate sounds as they struck. He looked at the forest on the bank of the stream, saw the individual trees, the leaves, and the veining of each leaf, saw the very insects upon them. The locusts, the brilliant-bodied flies, the gray spiders stretching their webs from twig to twig. He noted the prismatic colors in all the dewdrops upon 1,000,000 blades of grass, the humming of the gnats that danced above the eddies of the stream, the beating of the dragonfly's wings, the strokes of the water spider's legs, like oars which had lifted their boat. All these made audible music. A fish slid along beneath his eyes, and he heard the rush of its body parting the water. He had come to the surface facing down the stream. In a moment the visible world seemed to whirl slowly round, himself the pivotal point, and he saw the bridge, the fort, the soldiers upon the bridge, the captain, the sergeant, the two privates, his executioners. They were in silhouette against the blue sky. They shouted and gesticulated, pointing at him. The captain had drawn his pistol, but did not fire. The others were unarmed. Their movements were grotesque and horrible, their forms gigantic. Suddenly he heard a sharp report, and something struck the water smartly within a few inches of his head, spattering his face with spray. He heard a second report, and saw one of the sentinels with his rifle at his shoulder, a light cloud of blue smoke rising from the muzzle. The man in the water saw the eye of the man on the bridge, gazing into his own through the sights of the rifle. He observed that it was a gray eye and remembered having read that gray eyes were keenest and that all famous markmen had them. Nevertheless, this one had missed. A counterswirl had caught Farquhar and turned him half round. He was again looking into the forest on the bank opposite the fort. The sound of a clear, high voice in a monotonous sing-song now rang out behind him and came across the water with a distinctness that pierced and subdued all other sounds, even the beating of the ripples in his ears. Although no soldier, he had frequented camps enough to know the dread significance of that deliberate, drawling, aspirated chant. The lieutenant on shore was taking a part in the morning's work. How coldly and pitilessly, with what an even, calm intonation, presaging and enforcing tranquility in the men. With what accurately measured intervals fell those cruel words. Attention, company, shoulder arms, ready, aim, fire. Farquhar dived as deeply as he could. The water roared in his ears like the voice of Niagara, yet he heard the dulled thunder of the volley and, rising again toward the surface, met shining bits of metal, singularly flattened, oscillating slowly downward. Some of them touched him on the face and hands, then fell away, continuing their descent. One lodged between his collar and neck. It was uncomfortably warm, and he snatched it out. As he rose to the surface, gasping for breath, he saw that he had been a long time underwater. He was perceptibly farther downstream, nearer to safety. The soldiers had almost finished reloading. The metal ramrods flashed all at once in the sunshine as they were drawn from the barrels, turned in the air, and thrust into their sockets. The two sentinels fired again, independently and ineffectually. The hunted man saw all this over his shoulder. He was now swimming vigorously with the current. His brain was as energetic as his arms and legs. He thought with the rapidity of lightning. The officer, he reasoned, will not make that martinet's error a second time. It is as easy to dodge a volley as a single shot. He has probably already given the command to fire at will. God help me, I cannot dodge them all. An appalling plash within 2 yards of him was followed by a loud, rushing sound, diminuendo, which seemed to travel back through the air to the fort and died in an explosion which stirred the very river to its deeps. A rising sheet of water curved over him, fell down upon him, blinded him, strangled him. The cannon had taken a hand in the game. As he shook his head free from the commotion of the smitten water, he heard the deflected shot humming through the air ahead. and in an instant it was cracking and smashing the branches in the forest beyond. They will not do that again, he thought. The next time they will use a charge of grape. I must keep my eye upon the gun. The smoke will apprise me. The report arrives too late. It lags behind the missile. That is a good gun. Suddenly he felt himself whirled round and round, spinning like a top. The water, the banks, the forests, the now distant bridge, fort and men. All were commingled and blurred. Objects were represented by their colors only. Circular horizontal streaks of color. That was all he saw. He had been caught in a vortex and was being whirled on with a velocity of advance and gyration that made him giddy and sick. In a few moments he was flung upon the gravel at the foot of the left bank of the stream, the southern bank, and behind a projecting point which concealed him from his enemies. The sudden arrest of his motion, the abrasion of one of his hands on the gravel, restored him, and he wept with delight. He dug his fingers into the sand, threw it over himself in handfuls, and audibly blessed it. It looked like diamonds, rubies, emeralds. He could think of nothing beautiful which it did not resemble. The trees upon the bank were giant garden plants. He noted a definite order in their arrangement, inhaled the fragrance of their blooms. A strange, roseate light shone through the spaces among their trunks, and the wind made in their branches the music of Aeolian harps. He had no wish to perfect his escape, was content to remain in that enchanting spot until retaken. A whiz and rattle of grape shot among the branches high above his head roused him from his dream. The baffled cannoneer had fired him a random farewell. He sprang to his feet, rushed up the sloping bank, and plunged into the forest. All that day he traveled, laying his course by the rounding sun. The forest seemed interminable. Nowhere did he discover a break in it, not even a woodman's road. He had not known that he lived in so wild a region. There was something uncanny in the revelation. By nightfall he was fatigued, footsore, famishing. The thought of his wife and children urged him on. At last he found a road which led him in what he knew to be the right direction. It was as wide and straight as a city street, yet it seemed untraveled. No fields bordered it, no dwelling anywhere. Not so much as the barking of a dog suggested human habitation. The black bodies of the trees formed a straight wall on both sides, terminating on the horizon in a point, like a diagram in a lesson in perspective. Overhead, as he looked up through this rift in the wood, shone great golden stars looking unfamiliar and grouped in strange constellations. He was sure they were arranged in some order which had a secret and malign significance. The wood on either side was full of singular noises, among which, once, twice, and again, he distinctly heard whispers in an unknown tongue. His neck was in pain, and lifting his hand to it he found it horribly swollen. He knew that it had a circle of black where the rope had bruised it. His eyes felt congested. He could no longer close them. His tongue was swollen with thirst. He relieved its fever by thrusting it forward from between his teeth into the cold air. How softly the turf had carpeted the untraveled avenue. He could no longer feel the roadway beneath his feet. Doubtless, despite his suffering, he had fallen asleep while walking, for now he sees another scene. Perhaps he has merely recovered from a delirium. He stands at the gate of his own home. All is as he left it, and all bright and beautiful in the morning sunshine. He must have traveled the entire night. As he pushes open the gate and passes up the wide white walk, he sees a flutter of female garments. His wife, looking fresh and cool and sweet, steps down from the veranda to meet him. At the bottom of the steps she stands waiting, with a smile of ineffable joy, an attitude of matchless grace and dignity. Ah, how beautiful she is! He springs forward with extended arms. As he is about to clasp her, he feels a stunning blow upon the back of the neck. A blinding white light blazes all about him with a sound like the shock of a cannon. Then all is darkness and silence. Peyton Farquhar was dead. His body, with a broken neck, swung gently from side to side beneath the timbers of the Owl Creek Bridge. Next story, The Boarded Window. In 1830, Only a few miles away from what is now the great city of Cincinnati lay an immense and almost unbroken forest. The whole region was sparsely settled by people of the frontier, restless souls who no sooner had hewn fairly habitable homes out of the wilderness and attained to that degree of prosperity which today we should call indigence than impelled by some mysterious impulse of their nature they abandoned all and pushed farther westward, to encounter new perils and privations in the effort to regain the meager comforts which they had voluntarily renounced. Many of them had already forsaken that region for the remoter settlements, but among those remaining was one who had been of those first arriving. He lived alone in a house of logs surrounded on all sides by the great forest, of whose gloom and silence he seemed a part, for no one had ever known him to smile nor speak a needless word. His simple wants were supplied by the sale or barter of skins of wild animals in the river town, for not a thing did he grow upon the land which, if needful, he might have claimed by right of undisturbed possession. There were evidences of improvement. A few acres of ground immediately about the house had once been cleared of its trees, the decayed stumps of which were half concealed by the new growth that had been suffered to repair the ravage wrought by the axe. Apparently, the man's zeal for agriculture had burned with a failing flame, expiring in penitential ashes. The little log house, with its chimney of sticks, its roof of warping clapboards weighted with traversing poles and its chinking of clay, had a single door and, directly opposite, a window. The latter, however, was boarded up. Nobody could remember a time when it was not, and none knew why it was so closed. Certainly not because of the occupant's dislike of light and air, for on those rare occasions when a hunter had passed that lonely spot the recluse had commonly been seen sunning himself on his doorstep if heaven had provided sunshine for his need. I fancy there are few persons living today who ever knew the secret of that window, but I am one, as you shall see. The man's name was said to be Mylok. He was apparently 70 years old, actually about 50. Something besides years had had a hand in his aging. His hair and long, full beard were white, his gray, lusterless eyes sunken. His face singularly seamed with wrinkles which appeared to belong to two intersecting systems. In figure he was tall and spare, with a stoop of the shoulders, a burden bearer. I never saw him. These particulars I learned from my grandfather, from whom also I got the man's story when I was a lad. He had known him when living nearby in that early day. One day Moloch was found in his cabin, dead. It was not a time and place for coroners and newspapers, and I suppose it was agreed that he had died from natural causes, or I should have been told, and should remember. I know only that with what was probably a sense of the fitness of things, the body was buried near the cabin, alongside the grave of his wife, who had preceded him by so many years that local tradition had retained hardly a hint of her existence. That closes the final chapter of this true story, excepting, indeed, the circumstance that many years afterward, in company with an equally intrepid spirit, I penetrated to the place and ventured near enough to the ruined cabin to throw a stone against it, and ran away to avoid the ghost which every well-informed boy thereabout knew haunted the spot. But there is an earlier chapter, that's supplied by my grandfather. When Moloch built his cabin and began laying sturdily about with his axe to hew out a farm, the rifle, meanwhile, his means of support. He was young, strong, and full of hope. In that eastern country whence he came he had married, as was the fashion, a young woman in all ways worthy of his honest devotion, who shared the dangers and privations of his lot with a willing spirit and light heart. There is no known record of her name. Of her charms of mind and person tradition is silent, and the doubter is at liberty to entertain his doubt. But God forbid that I should share it. Of their affection and happiness there is abundant assurance in every added day of the man's widowed life. For what but the magnetism of a blessed memory could have chained that venturesome spirit to a lot like that? One day Moloch returned from gunning in a distant part of the forest to find his wife prostrate with fever and delirious. There was no physician within miles, no neighbor, nor was she in a condition to be left to summon help. So he set about the task of nursing her back to health, but at the end of the third day she fell into unconsciousness and so passed away, apparently, with never a gleam of returning reason. From what we know of a nature like his we may venture to sketch in some of the details of the outline picture drawn by my grandfather. When convinced that she was dead, Malak had sense enough to remember that the dead must be prepared for burial. In performance of this sacred duty, he blundered now and again, did certain things incorrectly, and others which he did correctly were done over and over. His occasional failures to accomplish some simple and ordinary act filled him with astonishment, like that of a drunken man who wonders at the suspension of familiar natural laws. He was surprised, too, that he did not weep, surprised and a little ashamed. Surely it is unkind not to weep for the dead. Tomorrow, he said aloud, I shall have to make the coffin and dig the grave, and then I shall miss her when she is no longer in sight. But now, she is dead, of course, but it is all right. It must be all right, somehow. Things cannot be so bad as they seem. He stood over the body in the fading light, adjusting the hair and putting the finishing touches to the simple toilet, doing all mechanically, with soulless care. And still through his consciousness ran an undersense of conviction that all was right, that he should have her again as before, and everything explained. He had had no experience in grief. His capacity had not been enlarged by use. His heart could not contain it all, nor his imagination rightly conceive it. He did not know he was so hard struck, that knowledge would come later and never go. Grief is an artist of powers as various as the instruments upon which he plays his dirges for the dead, evoking from some the sharpest, shrillest notes, from others the low, grave chords that throb recurrent like the slow beating of a distant drum. Some natures it startles, some it stupefies. To one it comes like the stroke of an arrow, stinging all the sensibilities to a keener life. To another as the blow of a bludgeon, which in crushing benumbs. We may conceive Malak to have been that way affected, for, and here we are upon surer ground than that of conjecture, no sooner had he finished his pious work than, sinking into a chair by the side of the table upon which the body lay, and noting how white the profile showed in the deepening gloom, he laid his arms upon the table's edge and dropped his face into them, tearless yet and unutterably weary. At that moment came in through the open window a long, wailing sound like the cry of a lost child in the far deeps of the darkening wood. But the man did not move. Again, and nearer than before, sounded that unearthly cry upon his failing sense. Perhaps it was a wild beast, perhaps it was a dream, for Malak was asleep. Some hours later, as it afterward appeared, this unfaithful watcher awoke and lifting his head from his arms intently listened. He knew not why. There in the black darkness by the side of the dead, recalling all without a shock, he strained his eyes to see. He knew not what. His senses were all alert, his breath was suspended, his blood had stilled its tides as if to assist the silence. Who, what had waked him, and where was it? Suddenly the table shook beneath his arms, and at the same moment he heard, or fancied that he heard, a light, soft step. Another. Sounds as of bare feet upon the floor. He was terrified beyond the power to cry out or move. Perforce he waited there in the darkness through seeming centuries of such dread as one may know, yet live to tell. He tried vainly to speak the dead woman's name, vainly to stretch forth his hand across the table to learn if she were there. His throat was powerless, his arms and hands were like lead. Then occurred something most frightful. Some heavy body seemed hurled against the table with an impetus that pushed it against his breast so sharply as nearly to overthrow him. And at the same instant he heard and felt the fall of something upon the floor with so violent a thump that the whole house was shaken by the impact. A scuffling ensued, and a confusion of sounds impossible to describe. Malak had risen to his feet. Fear had by excess forfeited control of his faculties. He flung his hands upon the table. Nothing was there. There is a point at which terror may turn to madness, and madness incites to action, with no definite intent, from no motive but the wayward impulse of a madman. Malak sprang to the wall, with a little groping seized his loaded rifle, and without aim discharged it. By the flash which lit up the room with a vivid illumination, he saw an enormous panther dragging the dead woman toward the window, its teeth fixed in her throat. Then there were darkness blacker than before and silence. And when he returned to consciousness, the sun was high and the wood vocal with songs of birds. The body lay near the window, where the beast had left it when frightened away by the flash and report of the rifle. The clothing was deranged, the long hair in disorder, the limbs lay anyhow. From the throat, dreadfully lacerated, had issued a pool of blood not yet entirely coagulated. The ribbon with which he had bound the wrists was broken. The hands were tightly clenched. Between the teeth was a fragment of the animal's ear. Next story, the stillness. He cringed in shuddering awe beneath the stillness. He could not stand the heavy, deep silence of it, the muffled, sucking thickness absorbing so completely all sound into its deadening mat. He had gotten so that he had to be perpetually stopping himself from screaming. He had to keep watch on himself always. He was terrified that he might go mad. He feared the oppression of the awful quiet would craftily draw his reason away from him. He did not want to scream. He did not want to attempt to defy the harrowing, rending silence. He was afraid of the blanketing, saturating weight of the stillness. Sometimes when he could bring himself to think, he thought that he might after all like to go about shouting at the top of his lungs. His mind kept on surreptitiously toying with the thought of the relief from the thing. He thought of it a lot. He knew that shouting about his own farm would not do him any good. He was too far away from everything and everyone in the strip of valley hemmed in between the rolling hills. Of course, there was Old Man Efforts. Old Man Efforts did not live so very far away. He knew he could not count on Efforts. Efforts had lived there too long in the stillness that rolled down to him from the hills and came together to lie flat and sluggish, thudding down on the valley land. If he could bring himself to walk into the 10-mile-off town shouting so that other people would follow after him shouting, so that there would be some kind of continuous, human noise for a while, it was that he wanted more than anything else, human noise. At night he would wake suddenly from his heavy, quiet slumber, from the dreamless, ponderous pit of it, and listen to the stillness. When he first went to bed, it would take him hours before he could get himself off to sleep. He dreaded the muted, frantic struggle of those dragging, pulling hours in which he would try to shut his ears to the soundless, deafening silence that throbbed noiselessly from a great distance and was noiseless in the room all about him, and pressed noiselessly against his blood-filled eardrums. He had the feeling at night that the stillness became more real, sweeping in a greater rush down the hills, that it had an heightened, insidious power to get inside of him. He would toss about on his narrow wooden bed for hours, moving cautiously and carefully so as not to do anything that would offend the drugged burden of the silence. He would move a leg or an arm slyly, and then he would lie quite quiet for a time, holding his breath until the cracking pain came plunging again and again into his chest. He could feel the stillness filling in all the spaces and crevices around him, so that he thought it rose and swelled hideously. He was afraid of those hours before he went to sleep, before he could drop off with that overwhelming sense that in losing consciousness he was consciously letting himself drown in a tremendous, swollen wave of silence. And then toward morning, that sudden, inevitable awakening, his rousing himself to listen, his whole body becoming rigid, tautly holding itself with straining, shaking muscles to the position in which he lay, the sweat breaking out all over him and trickling coldly down from his armpits along his sides, his cunning shifting of his head so that he could clear his ears to hear better, his futile hearkening for the sound that never came, his intensive shivering waiting for it, and nothing but the stillness. He could never make himself move. The thing was so actual, suffocatingly potent, malignant. He had grown terrified of attempting to disrupt it in any of those little ways at his command. He had begun to think that the noise he would make would not be a noise. He could not have stood the shock of making a noise that would be quite vacantly without sound. All day long, working in his fields, he used to wonder at it. In the sunlight, it was with him still and baited. It rose up to him from the ground at his feet, from the soil it had wormed itself into. It crushed down on him from the clear, blue sweep of the sky. It spread unseen toward him down the long, uncertain slopes of the hills, coming on always from all sides and staying. It had become so that nothing was real to him. Nothing but the stillness that drenched everything, stifling and choking. The old mare working her way in front of the plow along the narrowed, deepening furrows was a ghost creature to him. The grayness of her blurred ahead of him in the brightest stream of sunlight. Her foolish, stilly gliding played horridly on his raw nerves. At all times she was a phantom animal, stirring with the intangible motion of the silence. He felt that she did not belong to him, that she was a thing of the stillness. He would trail after her, his quivering, thin hands on the plow handles, his eyes riveted on her bony withers. He would try to concentrate his thoughts on the way she moved, and then overcome quite suddenly with the quiet, insidious stealth of her ambling. He would pull her up and stop to mop his forehead, his eyes going slowly around him as if he almost expected to see the thing that had lain that smothering, strangling hold on to him. His one and only companion was a yellow mongrel that had come slinking in at the farm gate, its tail drooping between its legs. He had been glad at first of having the dog with him, and then gradually he had come to feel the oddness of the animal. If he could have done so, he would have turned the dog out again into the stillness from which it had come to him. He was sure that the mongrel must be old, unnaturally old. He could not understand the dog's awful quiet. In his heart he was scared of the dog. The mongrel followed incessantly at his heels, always with dragging tail. Whenever his eyes turned behind him, they met the mongrel's eyes that were fixed on him. The eyes that were filled with that uncanny, beaten look as if it had been horridly cowed. There was an age of agony in the dog's eyes. As the days went on, he became more and more afraid of the mongrel's eyes. He had come out to the farm to start with because of the silence. He had felt that he would have to get away from the noise and the tumultuous uproar of the city. After what he had done, he could not stand it. He had gotten away. He thought now that his mind would snap, that it would break from under the lull which had come into it, the lull which devastated him with its hushed brutality. He had never been fond of people. Even in those days back there in the city, before he had done the thing that was wrong, he had mistrusted them. And after it he had run from them, run wildly and unthinkingly to cover with the fear of them coming on behind him. The deathly, lonely farm was to him at that time a haven of rest. He had made up his mind to live on the farm until the end of his life. He used to think bitterly of his waiting so patiently for his death. When he could think of anything other than the silence, he thought of his dying, of life being squeezed out of him by the shrouded quiet. Sometimes he would wonder if it were death that ominously waited for him in that appalling, threatening stillness. There had been days when he had tried to recall the sound of voices he had known. He had spent long hours in awakening in his memory those voices. He had wanted particularly to think of people laughing. He used to want to get the pitch of their laughing, to surround himself with the vibration of reiterated laughter. And then when he had gotten it so that he almost heard it, so that he felt that with concentrated attention he might hear the laughing, he would find himself listening to the frightful, numbing stillness. He had not the courage to go on trying that. Following the plow and the old gray mare through the fields with the dog skulking abjectly at his heels, he would think of that thing which he had done that had ostracized him from the rest of humanity. He never thought of the possibility of making his life over again. He could not have thought of it if he had wanted to. It was all too hopeless, too impossible to think about. The deadening quiet in which he had been steeped had drained him, sapped from him all initiative. When evening came, he would go into his shack and close the door. He would light the oil lamp on the old table that stood in the center of the room, and he would go about getting supper for himself and the mongrel. He took great care always to move his pots and pans gently. If he picked up a plate, he did it slowly, softly. When he put his bowl of food on the table, he slid it consciously onto the surface without noise, and going to and fro not oftener than he had to. His feet in their padded moccasins lifted him to his toes. He ate quietly and quickly, swallowing his food without chewing, feeding himself and the dog with his fingers. and all the while feeling that the stillness was rushing down from the hills and gathering to greater force about him. And when he was quite finished with the clearing away of his dishes, he would sit beside the table, the mongrel in front of him, and he would think frantically of the relief of talking. His lips would begin to quiver hideously, to move. That hoarse, inhuman muttering that had no sound of voice in it would start, and then he would see the dog's eyes, filled with that horrid, beaten look, fixed on his mouth, and he would stop, gasping. Once every little while, Old Man Efforts would come down to the shack in the valley. He knew nothing of Old Man Efforts other than that ever since he had come to live at the farm, Efforts had stopped in for an evening now and again. At first, he had resented Old Man Efforts coming. Later, when he had seen that Efforts would not interfere with him, he had not minded so much. He had become quite used to seeing the bent, huddled figure of the man trailing down the hillside and shambling into the room to sit there opposite to him quite silent. Of late he had gone about fetching the old man a glass of cider and a piece of bread, and they had sat facing each other, never talking, just sitting rigidly with the dog on the floor between them and the silence spilling itself in gigantic floods all around them. And then Old Efforts would light his pipe, and when he had finished it he would get up and go out of the door. And after he had watched Old Man Efforts go, with the feeling that he might not be real, he would stumble up to his room to lie in the narrow wooden bed, trying to shut his ears to the deafening silence about him, cringing between his blankets as the swell of it heightened insidiously. He knew that the stillness had swamped itself into Old Man Efforts. He could see the stamp of it in the uncertain, stupefied face, in the bewildered eyes that had behind them something of the look that stayed on in the dog's eyes, in the thin-lipped mouth that drooled at the corners, in the old man's still, quiet way of moving, the unreal, phantom way in which the gray mare moved. He did not know why the old man should come to him to sit so dumbly opposite him for a whole evening. He did not care. He was long past caring. There were times when he thought he might tell Old Man Efforts of that thing which he had done years ago, and which had isolated him from his fellows. Not that he thought so much of it. He had almost forgotten it. The stillness had made him forget everything but itself, had pushed everything out of his mind before its own spreading weight. But he kept the thought of speaking to Efforts of what he had done in the back of his head. He knew how his telling it to Efforts could not fail to act. He knew that something would infallibly happen, that the surprise of it could not help but penetrate the thickness of Effort's silence. He always felt, soothing himself with the thought of relief, that when the power of the stillness became unbearable, he would shock Old Efforts into talk. There were moments when he hungered savagely to force Old Efforts out of his walling quiet, moments when he was starving for the comfort of human sound. His voice and Effort's voice, voices that would rise above the stillness, voices that would penetrate cunningly through the quiet, voices that would speak and answer each other. He was sitting in the center of his lamplit room. He had had his supper and had cleared away the dishes with his usual crafty carefulness. He had lighted his pipe. He sat in the chair beside the table, his body quite rigid, his arms and legs stiffened to a torturing quiet. The mongrel crouched at his feet. There was something strange in the way the animal lay, in its tightened muscles that pulled and twitched as it breathed. Whenever he looked down, his eyes met the dog's eyes. Outside, the heavy shadows of the night crept along the ground, pushed on by the rushing, rising silence behind them. He knew that the stillness was rolling down the slope of those long hills. He knew that its awful quiet was gathering in the valley. He knew that it was trickling horridly still into the low-ceilinged room. He had the feeling for the thousandth time that the most minute noise was swallowed up in the stillness before it came into being. He looked up then to see the door shoved warily ajar. A wrinkled, ugly hand showed against the dark wood in a lighter patch of brown. A coarse-booted foot came behind the swing of the door. Standing against the black of the night, he saw Old Man Efforts. He watched the old man come into the room. He saw him pull up a chair, lifting it from off the floor and setting it down opposite to him within the pooling space of the yellow lamplight. He stared at Efforts as he sank into the chair. Old Man Efforts took out his pipe and lit it. He kept his eyes on Efforts as he had so often done. On the uncertain, stupefied face that was turned to him. On the bewildered eyes that had something behind them of the look that stayed on in the dog's eyes. On the thin-lipped mouth that drooled at the corners. He got up then and went on his toes to the door and closed it softly. He felt that Effort's eyes were on him, and the mongrel's eyes. He came back and sat down in his chair. They both smoked quietly. He remembered the glass of cider and the piece of bread. He could not bring himself to move tonight. He felt the suffocating weight of the stillness crowding past him. It was expanding menacingly throughout the small room. It filled in all about him. Presently, Old Man Efforts would finish his pipe and would get up and shamble out of the door. He would sit there and watch him go as he always watched, wondering if perhaps Old Man Efforts was not real. And then he would stumble up to bed and lie awake and listen to the stillness that grew greater and greater. He wanted the relief from that silence, wanted it desperately, passionately. He remembered that if he told Efforts of that thing that he had come so near forgetting in the smothering quiet, that he would have what he so frantically wanted. Some human speech, human talk that would break the silence even for a little while. The sound of human voices that would rise and answer each other. He glanced at the old man surreptitiously. He tried to think what expression would come into that stupid face with the bewildered eyes. He tried to see the thin-lipped, drooling mouth as it would look with the lips of it startled into moving. He sat very still. Words formed themselves, lagging into his mind. I am going to tell. He would start to say it to Old Man Efforts that way. He could not stand the stillness any longer. Anything was better than the appalling agony of the quiet. He made a little tentative movement with his thin, shaking hands. He felt that Efforts was staring at him. The mongrel crouching at his feet moved stealthily. He heard no sound from the animal's moving. He knew it had gotten to its feet. He saw it standing there between where he sat and where Efforts sat. He felt his lips begin to quiver. I am going to. He got the words into his head again through the menacing, waiting stillness. He muttered something. Old Man Efforts leaned forward, his hand behind his ear. In a sudden blinding flash of knowledge, he realized that Old Man Efforts was deaf. He felt his mouth twisting around his face. He tried then to shout. His eyes avoided the mongrel's eyes that he knew were filled with that uncanny, beaten look and were fixed on his jerking, grimacing mouth. All about him the ominous, malignant silence. He tried again and again to speak. He could not talk. Sweat stood out in great, glistening beads on his forehead and dribbled blindingly into his wide, distended eyes. His body shook with the stupendous effort he was making. His tongue was swollen. He could feel his throat tightening so that it hurt. He could not get his words into that hoarse, inhuman muttering that had no sound of voice in it. He kept on trying and trying to speak. He saw that Old Man Efforts had finished his pipe. He watched him get out of his chair and go shambling across the room and through the door. He sat there. His hands went up to his working mouth. He wanted to hide the hideous jerking of it. His eyes met the mongrel's eyes. The stillness grew appalling. Thank you for spending your time with me tonight on the Rainy Night Storyteller. If you enjoyed this journey into the eerie and unknown, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. It helps others discover our stories. And if you'd like to join me for more tales that will chill your spine or spark your imagination, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss a story, rain or shine. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful and your dreams just a little mysterious. Goodbye for now.